Hello, my name is John Schmidt and I am the Electoral Commissioner for New South Wales. The 2023 New South Wales state election involves over 5 million electors and will be one of the biggest single community events held in New South Wales in 2023. We established more than 300 early voting centres and more than 2,500 voting centres across New South Wales on election day. We also employ more than 20,000 people to assist in conducting the elections. These webinars are intended to assist registered political parties, candidates, scrutineers, and other political participants by explaining relevant processes, procedures, and compliance obligations for the election. However, I must stress that the content of these webinars is not a substitute for the law. While the New South Wales Electoral Commission will provide information, it does not provide legal advice. If political participants are in doubt about any legal matters regarding the election, they should seek their own independent legal advice. I and everyone at the New South Wales Electoral Commission looks forward to delivering the 2023 New South Wales state elections with transparency, integrity, fairness and safety. I hope you find these webinars both informative and engaging.
Good morning and welcome to our Candidate Information webinar. Today we will be focusing on and talking you through the counting and the results process for the 2023 New South Wales state election. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we work today and the Aboriginal people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past and present and recognise the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Amber King and I'm the Nominations and Electoral Material Team Lead. Today I'm joined by Diana Kasefi, the Manager, Counting and Results. Thanks, Diana.
Thanks, Amber.
Now, if you do have any questions throughout today's webinar, we do ask that you visit slido.com and use the hashtag New South Wales State Election to ask any of your questions. And Diana and I will endeavour to answer them as we progress through the webinar. But if there are any left, we will respond to them towards the end of today's webinar. If you experience any technical difficulties, we do ask that you SMS 0417 176 075 for assistance. Now, I'd just like to start by providing you an overview of the election in numbers. Now, I appreciate that a number of you will have seen this in previous webinars. However, I do want to bring to your attention the number of postal vote applications. So last week in our webinar, we indicated that our postal vote projections had exceeded, or postal vote applications had exceeded 400,000 applications. However, at end of business yesterday, at the close of postal vote applications, I believe we actually exceeded 540,000 postal vote applications. Yeah. Now, to highlight some key dates, and we will go through our dates in further detail with you throughout the webinar today. Early voting will close at 6 p.m. this coming Friday, the 24th of March, and as you are aware, the election is this coming Saturday, the 25th of March. And I'll go through the counting timeline in more detail with Diana as we progress. The New South Wales Electoral Commission website is being updated daily to provide you an overview of our metrics. So our postal vote, our number of postal vote applications by district, also the return of the postal vote envelopes and the scrutiny being undertaken of those envelopes will be available on our website by district. And we'll also have on the website, Diana, the number of ordinary votes being undertaken by district in each of our early voting centres. To give you an idea of
the voter turnout.
That's right, prior to election day.
Yes.
Okay. So it is anticipated, due to the increased postal vote numbers, that there may be a delay or a longer than expected time for the processing of our results for the election, because following the close of or the return of the postal vote applications, each envelope still needs to go through scrutiny.
A level of scrutiny.
The ballot papers are extracted, and then the ballot papers, sorry Diana?
Yes, and by they are extracted, then they need to be unfolded before they reach the count. So it takes time to process the declaration vote envelope.
Now I would like to talk about election day to start us off today. So all voting centres will commence at 8 a.m. and will close at 6 p.m. this Saturday. All voting centres will issue ballot papers for all districts within New South Wales. So an elector who visits a voting centre within the district they are enrolled, they will be issued an ordinary vote. If an elector attends a voting centre in the district they're not enrolled, they'll actually be issued an absent vote, and their vote will be placed in an envelope and returned to the centralised declaration vote centre for processing and counting.
Yes.
Now, electoral material is not able to be distributed on election day unless it has been registered with the New South Wales Electoral Commission. It is an offence to distribute electoral material that has not been registered with the New South Wales Electoral Commission. The registration of electoral material closed last Friday, the 17th of March. Now, while posters or call flutes do not need to be registered, I would like to remind all the participants that posters and call flutes are still required to meet the legislative requirements, and each poster is required to have the authoriser's details and street address and the printer's details on each poster, and that includes the printer's name and their street address. In both the authoriser's details and the printer's details, a PO box cannot be used.
So we need a full address
A full address.
Not a PO box.
Yeah, a full address that the authoriser can be found at during the business hours.
Okay.
Now, Ausgrid and Essential Energy have asked that no posters be attached to power poles. They have advised us that they are removing any posters or call flutes attached to power poles, and that they will be charging candidates or participants for the removal of posters. Now, the Department of Education have also asked that we encourage our candidates and their volunteers to not display posters at the entry of our polling places or schools prior to 4:30 p.m. on Friday afternoon, so Friday prior to election day. And we do ask that you do pass this on to your volunteers or people that will be helping with the display of your posters at the entry of each of our voting centres or at a school or Department of Education premise. Now, the recycling of electoral material. Your volunteers and candidate workers are not permitted to enter a voting centre on election day or an early voting centre to collect electoral material that may have been discarded by an elector. Where you would like an elector to return your electoral material to you, we do encourage that you ask the elector to bring that back as they exit the voting centre. We also ask that you encourage your volunteers or your candidate workers that will be at the voting centres on election day to take your posters and call flutes with you. So please remove the posters that you do affix to the school fences or the premises for which we use as a voting centre, and take them with you at the end of election day. Now, some of the election day activities that are undertaken in the election manager's office is that the election manager will manage any access to venues that may be a problem in the morning on election day, any staffing matters that may arise, and also ensure that each voting centre has sufficient election material available to them. They'll ensure that all our voting centres commence operation at 8 a.m. Now, through the day, the election managers still have quite a busy day while voting is being undertaken in each of the voting centres. They're preparing for election night. So the election managers will prepare for the commencement of the early voting initial counts that will start at 6 p.m. on election night. They'll also prepare for the return of electoral materials from each of the voting centres following counting on election evening. And they'll also receive any early voting material that may not have been returned on the Friday prior to the election. So there's a number of activities still occurring in our election managers' offices on election day. And then on election night, the election manager will receipt and enter the election night results from each of our voting centres on election day. Now, Deanna, that occurs by a number of phone calls from our voting centre managers, is my understanding?
That's correct, Amber. So there are 3 results phone calls that are made to the election manager's office. The first phone call is expected to be the LA initial count results, followed by the results for the TCP candidates count, and followed by the results for the Legislative Council. In addition to the 3 phone calls for the results, there is a duty of care that's expected the voting centre manager to call and to give assurance to the election manager that they are leaving the venue safely.
Okay, and that's the call that we wait to receive, and we know at that point in time our voting centre managers are on their way back to return their material to the election manager's office. Now, the return of material to the election manager's office is anticipated to occur, we should start receiving those first deliveries from about 8 p.m. for the smaller voting centres till about midnight on election night. The election manager will receive return of materials. While that's being undertaken, they'll also have another team, Deanna, commencing the initial count for the early voting centres.
Yes, that's correct, Amber. So they are actually, as we said earlier, the election managers will select a venue or a number of venues, early voting centres that will be counting on election night, and they will have a team of staff to commence the count on them.
Okay, thanks, Deanna. And some other activities that occur over the election weekend. So we've talked about what's occurring in the election manager's office on election night, but on election Sunday, the election manager will receipt any materials that were not returned on election night from a voting centre. They will prepare material for dispatch to our centralised operations. So we need our election managers to pull together and prepare material for return to the Legislative Council Count Centre and also the Centralised Declaration Vote Centre. And then in a number of instances, those election managers will actually have that material collected so that it can be available to the centralised venues for activities to commence on election Monday. Now, in the centralised operations, we will also receipt any of those materials that are collected on election Sunday, and we will commence the allocation of work for those centralised operations to ensure that staff are able to commence activities on Monday morning, Deanna.
That's right, Amber. And the shift in the centralised count centres on Monday commences at 7 a.m. So it's an early start. They need to have everything ready on Sunday.
Excellent. Now, we would like to remind you regarding the role of a scrutineers and the appointment of our scrutineers or your scrutineers at or throughout the election activities. So, as scrutineers play an important role through the election process. They represent the interest of candidates and political parties and are able to advise candidates and political parties of the procedures being undertaken in any of our venues. Their role is to satisfy the candidate that the election process is being carried out fairly, impartially, and with integrity. Scrutineers have the right to observe all stages of the voting, scrutiny and counting processes. Scrutineers are able to question the formality of ballot papers and raise any queries or concerns they may have with the venue manager. So that could be our voting centre managers, election managers, or any of the managers at any of our centralised sites. Now, some of the opportunities available to scrutineers include that they're able to inspect our ballot boxes prior to the commencement of voting, observe the telephone-assisted voting processes, witness the voting centre operations, observe the opening and extraction of ballot papers from the declaration envelopes at the centralised operations, and that includes both our centralised postal vote centre and the centralised declaration vote count centre, which I'll talk about in further detail. And they're also able to object to the formality of the ballot paper in the determination of the preferences.
And scrutineers are encouraged to actually listen to the briefing of the staff when an election manager or a count supervisor or a voting centre manager are briefing their staff on the count process, so that they understand how the count is going to occur, and this is an opportunity for them to ask all the questions they have.
And that's a good point, Deanna. And in addition to that, we actually have a recording of, it's our training videos that we actually use for the election staff regarding that briefing prior to the commencement of counting, and also in the morning prior to the opening of a voting centre available on our website for you. And we also went through those in further detail in the webinar last week, which also is available on the website. Now, scrutineers are not able to record or photograph any of our election processes. Scrutineers are not able to handle or touch ballot papers or declaration envelopes or any other electoral material in a voting centre or election venue. Not able to be in a room with ballot papers alone. And we do ask, if any of your scrutineers are eating or drinking, that they just be mindful that they're not near any of our ballot papers or our activities as they're being undertaken. Scrutineers are also not able to interfere or influence an elector at a voting centre or early voting centre. They are not able to obstruct the access to a voting centre. And a scrutineer who breaches any of these requirements may be found guilty of an offence. So there is further information available to our scrutineers, and again, we've also got our managers on site that can help any of our scrutineers with any of their questions, Deanna. There is on our website the scrutineer policy, and there is an appointment of scrutineer form. Now, it is really important that your scrutineers, when attending a venue, have an appointment of a scrutineer form, the SE 213. Again, this is available on the website, and a scrutineer is required to bring a form to each of the venues they attend. So, Deanna, if a scrutineer is attending the voting centre on election night, they need to have a form for that voting centre, and that will be held by our election manager. If your scrutineer is then returning on Monday to the election manager's office, they need another form. And the same goes for our centralised site. So for each venue your scrutineer is attending, they need another form.
So the form, Amber, needs to be signed by the candidate before they bring it in. Sometimes scrutineers turn up and say, I'm a scrutineer, can I have a scrutineer form?
That's correct.
There's no point in giving them that. It has to be signed by the candidates appointing them.
Now, once a scrutineer is appointed, we do issue them with a name badge, and we also ask our scrutineers to wear a vest. Now, it's a purple vest, and it makes it easy for us to differentiate our scrutineers from our election officials.
And the purple vest is in every venue.
In every venue.
The scrutineer is in a purple vest.
That's right. So each day a scrutineer attends, they'll be asked to wear a badge and to wear the vest. Now, the number of scrutineers that can be appointed. Now, only one scrutineer can be appointed for each voting centre or counting place at any one time. However, there are additional circumstances or conditions that may allow more than one scrutineer to be appointed, and that will be dependent on the individual venue, Deanna, and it's got to do with the number of counting points that the venue may have and or the space available to the venue manager to have additional scrutineers on site. So what we would like is, or we encourage our candidates and our participants, is to contact the individual venue. So with regards to the election manager's office for any counts that are occurring on the evening of election night or following election day, to contact the election manager or the voting centre manager to discuss where you would like more than one scrutineer to be appointed. And then if you would like further scrutineers to be appointed to a centralised site, please contact the candidate help desk and we'll be able to work through those requirements with you. There is a number of scrutiny resources available on our website for you, and I've also mentioned previously that we have that briefing available, which is that recorded video you may find useful, or your scrutineers may find useful prior to attending our count centre. Now, moving on to counting and results. On the screen here, you can see a timetable for our counting operations. So counting will commence from 6 p.m. on election day, and we will be commencing our initial counts for some early voting centres, as you've mentioned, Deanna, but also the initial postal count in our centralised postal vote centre.
Yes, there will be the postal count for envelopes that have been scrutinised as at a point in time.
And we'll only be commencing the Legislative Assembly count at the centralised postal count centre on election night, Deanna.
That's correct, Amber.
And then, as we've mentioned, there will be no counting on election Sunday. But from Monday, all the initial counts will continue and the check count process will commence. The postal vote return deadline ends at 6 p.m. on the 6th of April, so no results can be declared prior to this date. I'd also like to call out there will be no counting undertaken on Good Friday or Easter Sunday. The scrutiny of the declaration envelopes and postal envelopes will be completed on the 8th of April, and it's estimated the completion of the Legislative Assembly declaration of results will occur on the 14th of April, and the estimated completion of the Legislative Council declaration of results will occur on the 20th of April. Now, Deanna, all LA and LC ballot papers will undergo an initial count and a check count, is my understanding.
Yes, that's correct, Amber. They go through the initial count, which is the indicative count, and that commences on election night and continues until all the ballot papers have gone through, have been received, have gone through an initial count, and progressively they go through the check count.
And the check count's considered to be our final count figures that are used for the distribution of preferences?
The results from the check count are the official count results that will be used in the distribution of preferences to determine the elected candidates.
Now, there are a number of count locations and there is more detail regarding each of these count locations available on our centre, but counting will be undertaken, as we've mentioned, at each of our voting centres, the election manager's office, the centralised postal vote count centre, which is located at Carriage Works, the centralised declaration vote count centre, which is located at the International Convention Centre in Darling Harbour, and the Legislative Council Count Centre, again, it's located at the International Convention Centre at Darling Harbour. I just want to call out, when we're talking about the centralised declaration vote count centre and the Legislative Council's count centre, that they're considered to be two venues. So they are actually separated. And if you do have any scrutineers attending, they actually need to have that scrutineer form for the centralised dec vote centre and a separate scrutineer form for the Legislative Council Count Centre. Now, Deanna, we haven't mentioned with regards to the centralised declaration vote count centre, but we're anticipating we are going to receive over 680,000 declaration envelopes through the election that will come back to that centralised declaration vote count centre that need to be scrutinised, similar to the postal.
Yes.
And then extracted.
Yeah, they go through scrutiny to be accepted or rejected into the count. Then the ballot papers extracted from those envelopes and passed on to the count.
And so then they undergo the initial count
and a check count as well within the same centre.
It's a lot of envelopes.
A lot of ballot papers, yes.
True. Okay, so now just looking at election night and the counts that will be undertaken on election night. So from 6 p.m, the initial count of the Legislative Assembly and Legislative Council ballot papers will be conducted. And I think we've mentioned at each of those voting centres, the EM's office and our Legislative Assembly postal ballot papers. It's anticipated we'll have election results feed to the website at about 6:30 p.m. on election night, Deanna?
That would be from a very small voting centre, and by 6:30, as you know, from 6 o'clock there would be briefing of the staff and finalising their account of ballot papers before they commence the count. But we'll see at what time we'll receive the first results.
But they will be progressively updated throughout the evening. So once the results come through, as we've mentioned, our voting centre managers call them through to our election managers, who will enter them into our election management system, and they subsequently are progressively fed through to the website.
Yes.
Now, all counting will cease at 10:30 p.m. on election night, And as we've mentioned, there will be no counting on Election Sunday.
But there'll be other activities happening.
That's right. We've got a
So the
number of
office is not
activities
closed.
happening.
Yes.
So activities in both the election manager's office
And the centralised
centralised
count
sites.
centre.
Now, Deanna, on election night, the initial counts will be undertaken is the initial counts for the Legislative Assembly, and then we also undertake a 2 candidates preferred, which we'll talk through, and then the initial sort of the Legislative Council ballot papers. So if you wouldn't mind, Deanna, could you walk me through what is the initial count for the Legislative Assembly?
So, Amber, the initial count of the Legislative Assembly is where the ballot papers are examined and sorted into the first preference for each candidate, or to the informal pile. The informal pile is where the ballot paper doesn't have a first preference, it cannot be sorted to a candidate and it appears to be informal, or where the voting centre manager is not sure how to sort the ballot paper. Now these ballot papers will go eventually onto the check count where the election manager will make a determination on the ballot papers. However, the final formality of a ballot paper is determined within the computer count system, Amber, where those ballot papers are data entered, and that's where the final format. So there is no need to worry about any ballot paper that goes into these informal piles that may have been formal simply because the election manager was not sure at the time how to sort it.
So any ballot paper in the informals, we don't need to worry, because each ballot paper in the informal pile will go through the data entry process, which we'll talk about, and the formality will be determined.
It will be determined by the computer count system based on those preferences data entered into the system.
Thanks, Deanna. And then, Deanna, once we've completed the initial count on the Legislative Assembly ballot papers, those Legislative Assembly ballot papers will move into a 2 candidate preferred count?
Yes, the 2 candidates preferred, Amber, provides an indication of the likely election outcome in the Legislative Assembly for the district by distributing the preferences of the other candidates, these are the non-TCP candidates, to the TCP candidates. So who are these 2 CP candidates? Prior to election day, the Electoral Commissioner chooses 2 candidates in each district who are likely to be the final 2 remaining candidates once we conduct the distribution of preferences. It's not the official count, it's simply a count that gives an indication to the political participants of the likelihood of the outcome of the distribution of preferences. I insist it's not an official count, it's just an indicative count.
And we'll make the TCP results available progressively. So again, following that initial count, the 2 candidate preferred results will be published to our website, and that's one of the phone calls our voting centre managers need to make to our election managers on election night. And we will publish those 2 candidate preferred results progressively
as they are reported,
as they're received. And then, Deanna, the Legislative Council ballot papers will undergo that initial sort in our voting centres.
Yes, it's important, Amber, to note that it is an initial sort. The Legislative Council ballot paper is a complex ballot paper. It's large. It has voting above the line, options for to vote above the line, options to vote below the line. It's very complicated to determine formalities, so we focus on sorting the ballot papers on election night according to the first preference vote for each group that has a group voting square. And we sort the ballot papers. We isolate the blanks. These are the ballot papers where the elector chose not to mark their ballot papers and simply placed it in the ballot box without marking it. And there is the pile of others ballot papers, including the informals. The others pile, it's important to note that it contains ballot papers that are not just informal, it contains some of the formal ballot papers, and these are the ballot papers that have been marked below the line or marked above and below the line, and it's very hard on the night for an election official to determine their formality. That's why we place them all into one bundle, which is the others, and informals pile. Again, like the LA, all these ballot papers will go through a check count process where every single ballot paper will be re-examined, and where there are preferences, multi-preferences on them, there'll be data entered to determine the final formality.
So each of the ballot papers, so on the night we're just sorting to the groups above the line?
That's what, so every group above the line that has group voting square.
Our blanks and then our others. So that'll include any of the informal ballot papers, but wherever we've got preferences below the line or above the line and below the line.
Correct.
But they will go through a full data entry process.
All ballot papers will go through a check count process, and the multi-preference ballot papers will go through a data entry process.
And again, those results will be progressively updated and published to our website throughout election evening and as the initial counts progress from election Monday.
Yes.
So Deanna, we have mentioned all counting will cease at 10:30 p.m. on election night, and that's for the work, health and safety of all our staff at our voting centres. So you've mentioned that it's a very long day. They're starting at 7 a.m. And following 10:30, we do ask our voting centre managers to then pack up and return all their material from their voting centre to our election manager's office. Now, if there is any counts that aren't completed on election night, those initial counts will be completed in the election manager's office?
On Monday.
On
they
Monday.
will commence their count on Monday. They will still go through an initial count, Amber, before they put them through a check count. So the same cycle of results will be published for those venues from Monday onwards.
But it is anticipated that all of our voting centres will be able to complete their counts by 10:30.
That's what we are expecting, and unless something unforeseen happens, a larger than expected voter turnout in a particular, or they have staffing issues, yes, that might impact the completion of the count. But I need to, at this point, probably, Amber, mention and remind us that the order of the count is the priority is given to the Legislative Assembly, followed by the two candidates' preferred count, and then the Legislative Council count.
Thanks, Deanna. Now, if you do have any questions, again, please use slido.com and please use the hashtag New South Wales State Election to ask us any questions you may have about election day or the counting and result processes. So looking at the Legislative Assembly check count process, Deanna, so following the initial count, we will be conducting that check count of our Legislative Assembly, and that consists of a batching process and a data entry process. Would you mind just walking us through that?
Yes, so as we said, the check count is the official count from which the results will be used into the distribution of preferences. So it consists of two processes. The ballot papers are examined and separated into a single preference pile and a multi-preference pile. Those single preference ballot papers are registered into the computer count system as a bulk figure for every candidate. The multi-preference ballot papers go through a data entry process where they are data entered. All the preferences on each one of those ballot papers are data entered by a team of data entry staff, followed by quality assurance process. That would be the end of the check count before the results get published to the website.
And this process is undertaken in the election manager's office?
It's undertaken in the election manager's office on all the voting centre ballot papers. The same process occurs at the postal vote centre on the postal ballot papers, and the same at the declaration vote centre for the declaration vote ballot papers.
Now, Deanna, the distribution of preferences uses the optional preferential system. Now, the ballot paper instructions to an elector is that an elector can vote for the number 1 in the square next to the candidate of their choice, and then they may continue to vote for more candidates of their choice using the number 2 and so on.
That's correct. So in an optional preferential system, the elector is not required to number every square on the ballot paper. They have the choice. They can place the number 1 next to their chosen candidate, and they can choose to number as many squares as they like. So a ballot paper could have a 1, could have 1 and 2, 1, 2, 3, as many numbers as there are candidates. As long as there is only one number 1 on the ballot paper, it's formal. Now, for a candidate to be elected in an optional preferential system, they must receive an absolute majority. The absolute majority is calculated by dividing the number of total formal votes in the count by 2 and add 1.
Okay, and we're going to walk through this as an example now, Diana, so to help us understand what that means. So if we're looking at the distribution of preferences, at the end of the first count, Diana, would you be able to explain what we can see here?
So in this example, we have 4 candidates and we've done the first preference count. And at the end of the first preference count, the total number of formal votes is, as we can see on there, 8,756. To obtain the absolute majority, we divide that number by 2, then add 1, and the absolute majority, therefore, is 4,379. So can you see anybody with those candidates, Amber, with 4,379 votes?
No, so the highest candidate is candidate A, and at the end of their first preference count, am I right by saying they received 3,024?
That's right, even though that number is that's the highest amongst the 4 candidates, it's still not equal to the absolute majority. Therefore, at the end of the first preference count, no candidate is declared elected.
Okay, so then what happens?
Then what happens? So then we exclude the candidates with the lowest number of votes. In this scenario, Amber, it's candidate D with 890 votes.
So once we've excluded that first candidate, Diana, so we can see here candidate D has been excluded.
So what happens is we take the ballot papers of candidates D and sort them according to the second preference in this scenario, because they're the first preference vote, according to the number 2 for the remaining candidates. And you could see, Amber, that in this example, after the exclusion of candidate D, candidate A received 250 votes, candidate B received 441 votes, and candidate C received 87 votes. 112 ballot papers are exhausted.
And what does that mean?
Exhausted means those ballot papers did not have a second preference that we can pass on to a candidate. So they didn't have a valid preference after the number 1, therefore they're exhausted, and this is the end of life for those ballot papers. They're not included in the count
And
anymore.
is that the reason our new absolute majority has changed?
That's right, Amber. Because of these 112 ballot papers that exhausted, the number of total formal votes in the count now have reduced. So we recalculate the absolute majority, and in this scenario, the absolute majority is 4,323. However, still at count 2, no candidates received absolute majority.
Okay. So Diana, we then go on to have our second exclusion, and the second exclusion is candidate C, because that's the lowest number of votes.
That's the candidate C has the lowest number of votes, in this case. And again, we take the 2,377 ballot papers of candidate C. That's the ballot papers that his first preference votes, and the ballot papers received through the exclusion of candidate D. They all, those ballot papers are distributed according to the next available preference for the remaining candidates in the count. And in this scenario, Amber, we have 366 ballot papers that have exhausted, and we have a winner. You can see.
So we can see candidate B has been elected, and they've been elected, and we can see the distribution for candidate D of 441, and then you can see there was an additional 1,189. So they now have 4,182 votes.
Which it's above the absolute majority, that is 4,140.
and that was recalculated following those exhausted ballot papers of 366 following the exclusion of candidate C.
Yes, correct.
So even though candidate A at the end of the first preference had the higher number of first preference votes,
Yes.
Diana, it's interesting to see that candidate B, following the distributions of preferences, was actually the candidate that was elected.
Yes, that's right. So after the exclusion of candidate C, candidate B received the most number of votes, which took them to reach the absolute majority.
Thanks, Diana. So Diana, then following that, the distribution of preferences, it is anticipated or estimated that we will complete or conduct the distribution of preferences in each of the election managers' offices on Thursday the 13th of April. The time for each distribution of preferences will be published on our website.
Yes, just in the week prior to the 13th of April, we'll publish those dates and times.
And candidates and scrutineers or other participants are able to attend the election manager's office to watch the distribution
That's
of preferences
right.
occur.
Any person is welcome to attend the distribution of preferences. It happens within the computer count system. The election manager presses the button to run the count, and the DOP takes approximately 5 minutes to complete for each district.
And if you aren't able to attend the distribution of preferences, the results will be published on the New South Wales Electoral Commission's website, and the declaration of results will occur on Friday the 14th of April.
That's the estimated, yes, Amber, for the declaration.
Now, Diana, I think we're hoping to run the distribution of preferences, as we've mentioned, on Thursday the 13th. And we're hoping to run about 5 every 15 minutes. Does that sound about right?
There will be 5 distribution of preferences will be conducted, yes, in 5 districts.
Throughout that day.
Throughout the day.
And you can see the times on the website.
Yes. And hoping to complete, and it's expected to complete the distribution of preferences for all districts on that Thursday, the 13th of April.
Now, just a reminder again, if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to send them through. Now, Diana, if we look at the check count process for the Legislative Council, now this one's a little bit harder to explain, so
Let's see.
let's see. Okay.
It is a complicated
Bit more
and a large ballot paper, and the count is different, obviously, from Legislative Assembly. But yeah, the principle at a high level is very similar to the check count for the LA. The ballot papers are examined, and the above-the-line ballot papers are sorted into a single preference pile and a multi-preference pile. The single preference ballot papers are registered for the particular group as a bulk figure, and all the other ballot papers will be data entered individually by 2 different data entry operators, followed by reconciliation process to determine the formality within the computer count system.
So any ballot paper that has more than a 1 above the line will be data entered.
Will be data entered.
And that includes those ballot papers we talked about on election night that get moved into that others pile, which includes...
That's correct. The others including informals or ballot papers marked below the line, ballot papers marked above and below the line, ballot papers that have multi-preferences above the line. And all data entered.
And this process, Diana, will be all undertaken at the Legislative Council Count Centre?
So all the ordinary ballot papers that are issued in the voting centres and all early voting centres will be processed at the Legislative Council Count Centre. That's over 4 million ballot papers. The postal ballot papers for Legislative Council will be processed, continue to be processed at the centralised postal voting centre. So the initial count and the check count both will be conducted at the Legislative Council, the postal vote count centre. However, the process is exactly the same in all count centres. The declaration votes for Legislative Council will be check counted at the declaration vote count centre.
Okay. And scrutineers can attend any of those sites, centralised sites, to oversee this check count process of our Legislative Council ballot papers. Now, Deanna, looking at the Legislative Council distribution of preferences, as you've mentioned, the electors can vote both above the line and below the line.
Yes. Yeah.
However, a candidate is elected if they receive equal to or exceeding the number of the quota.
Yes. So while when we were talking about Legislative Assembly, Amber, we mentioned the absolute majority. For a proportional representation in a proportional representation system, a candidate to be elected, they need to receive the number of votes equal to the quota.
Okay. And we can see here a sample of the Legislative Council ballot paper. And by placing a 1 in the voting square above the line, you can see that's the equivalent of the elector marking 1.
Correct. The elector marking the ballot paper for those candidates below the line. That's how the count will be counted. The preferences will be counted. So that 1 above the line represents vote for the candidates below the line in the order they appear on that ballot paper underneath that particular group. As we can see, 1 to 18 in that group.
And then you can see again, I think using that same, you can see the 1 above the line, and you can see the candidates numbered, sequentially below the line under number 1, and then where the group 2 is displayed above the line for group A, then the candidate preferences start with the next available number.
Yes, so those preferences will be counted again as continue from the first group to the group that has a number 2, again in the order of the candidates appearing on that ballot paper for that group from 17 to 32 in this scenario.
Thanks, Deanna. Okay. So Deanna, would you mind starting to walk us through that distribution of preferences process and what is meant by the term quota?
So the quota, Amber, is determined by legislation, and the formula is we take the total number of formal votes in the count divided by the number to be elected, and for Legislative Council is 21. We add 1. And with the results of that formula, we disregard the fraction and again add 1. The numbers we have on screen there, the 4,451,146 votes, these are from the state general election 2019. These were the formal votes, and that was the quota in 2019, 202,325.
So what we're going to do now is use that that number or the quota from 2019, Deanna, to provide an overview or a snapshot of the distribution of preference process for the Legislative Council. Okay. So Deanna, at the first distribution of preferences or following the first preference count?
What happened? So Amber, before we go into this detail, it's important to note that this is a very high level explanation of the distribution of preferences under the proportional representation count. We cannot, in this example here, present all the principles of the proportional representation count, but it's just very high level. In this scenario, after the first preference count, we can see that 4 candidates received the quota, reached the quota, or have votes above the quota. So they are declared elected. However, we need 21 candidates to be elected in the Legislative Council. So we have 4 after the first preference count.
Now, Deanna, I just want to call out here, we're showing here currently we've got 4 candidates that reached the count, that were elected in the first instance, but for this example, there's actually 346 candidates in the Legislative Council election for 2019.
Yes, that's correct. So those 4 were elected at the first count out of 346 candidates.
Okay. So then we move on to the surplus, Diana.
So throughout the distribution of preferences, what happens with those candidates that have reached or exceeded the quota? We will be distributing their ballot papers to the remaining candidates in the count, one candidate at a time. We distribute the candidate that has the most surplus of votes first. So you could see candidate 81 here received 1,530,000 votes, 542 votes. Take out the quota from their total formal votes, and their surplus votes is 1,328,217 votes. So one at a time, we take the ballot papers of these candidates and distribute them to the candidates who are remaining in the count. That's the distribution of candidate 81. Again, we look at the next available preference on them, and they get distributed to the next.
And then?
Sorry, so the order you could see here, Amber, after the transfer of the ballot papers of the previously elected candidates, if any other more candidates have reached the quota, they be joined into the queue of distribution of surpluses. However, we have to distribute the candidates who had reached a quota at the previous count first.
So we distribute the surplus for candidate 81. And then we've continued the distribution of the surplus, in this instance for candidate 61. We'll move on to 46 and so on.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. And what occurs following the distribution of the surplus? So once that's completed,
so if we still haven't have the 21 candidates elected after we've distributed all the surpluses of the elected candidates, Amber, we start excluding the candidates with the lowest number of votes. And the exclusion basically works in principle similar to the distribution. So we look at the ballot papers of those candidates that have been excluded, and we sort them according to the next available preference for any candidate that's remaining in the count. And those votes are added to the candidates' existing votes to be counted.
And that process continues until we have 21
candidates. Now it's interesting, in a proportional representation count, we said candidates need to reach a quota to be elected. First, the quota, I'm not sure if you mentioned this, Amber, that the quota in a proportional representation count does not change. It's calculated at the start of the count, and it's remained the quota throughout the count. It is possible that candidates may be elected without reaching the quota, and this is in a scenario where we have the number of vacancies remaining to be filled equal the number of candidates remaining in the count. So it is possible that some candidates may be elected without reaching the quota in
the Legislative Council.
Yes.
Now, Diana, the distribution of preferences for the Legislative Council will be conducted at the Liverpool Street office at 175 Liverpool Street.
Yes, that's the New South Wales Electoral Commission's office in Liverpool Street.
We will be publishing the time for the distribution of preferences on our website, and we will be communicating that with each of the candidates. Again, candidates, scrutineers or other participants are welcome to attend the distribution of preferences for the Legislative Council count. It is estimated the completion, and there's a mistake on this slide, and I do apologise, but it is estimated that we will conduct the Legislative Council declaration on Thursday the 20th of April. and that we will publish those results on our website following the conduct of the distribution of preferences. Now, we will be streaming the distribution of preferences for the Legislative Council, so if you aren't able to make it, you will be able to watch that online as it is undertaken. Now, the distribution of preferences for the Legislative Council, for the Legislative Assembly, I think, Deanna, you indicated it'll take about 5 minutes for that to occur in our election managers' offices. But
Yep.
for the Legislative Council, it's going to take a little bit longer
It will
for
take
that
a bit
process
longer.
to be undertaken.
Approximately an hour and a bit. It depends on the number of ballot papers in the count and preferences.
Okay. So that brings to the end of our, walkthrough of the counting and results for both the Legislative Assembly and Legislative Council, from election night through to that check count process that will be undertaken in our election manager's office and the centralised count centres. We do have the candidate help desk available if you do have any questions following today's webinar. And you're able to contact us on the phone number on the screen or through the Contact Us form on our website. And we also have additional information available to you on the website, and we will continue to communicate with each of our participants through the election bulletin. Now, Deanna, we haven't received any questions today, which I think might be a first.
Oh, okay.
But if you do...
They can at any time. The questions could be emailed to the candidates help desk, Amber, and we're happy to answer any questions or if any further information is required.
Now, we only have one upcoming webinar, so we've conducted the counting and results one just now, and then following the election there'll be one final webinar to the series for the New South Wales state election regarding the post-election disclosure. And we will remind you of that as we near that date. And we will be conducting the live streaming of the Legislative Council distribution of preferences as we have touched on. I'd like to thank you, Deanna, for joining us today as we've got no questions. And if you do have anything, please do not hesitate to contact us following today's webinar. I'd like to thank you again, and I hope you found this webinar informative.